My name is Sawdah, and I am 32 years old as I speak these words, but for most of my life saying my own name out loud would have felt like sin because my voice belonged to everyone else. My parents, the teachers, the imams, the neighbors I was born into, Islam like one is born into air. You breathe it before you can speak. You obey it before you can think you fear it, before you can love it. My earliest memories are not toys or laughter, but the sound of prayer echoing through the walls of our small home before sunrise. My mother shaking me awake, whispering that Allah sees everything, that angels are recording our deeds, that every movement matters. I learned to bow before I learned to run. I learned to fear before I learned to dream, and I was praised for it. I was called righteous, blessed, good. The adults told me I would make my father proud, and that was the greatest honor a girl could achieve. My father was a man of respect and fear in our community. His voice carried authority and silence, carried warning. When he entered a room, I felt my spine straighten without thinking. He did not have to raise his hand or his voice for us to obey. His approval felt like warmth, and his disappointment felt like falling into a pit. I believed Allah lived in my father's approval, and I chased it with everything in me. I memorized Quran verses, even when I did not understand them. I covered my hair early, even when other girls did not. I lowered my gaze. I softened my steps. I shrank myself into what holiness looked like, and I believed this was love. I believed this was safety. I had a twin sister, and she was my other half. Our faces matched, but our hearts were different. She was quiet, sensitive, easily frightened. Then, while I learned to speak for both of us when adults asked questions, we slept side by side every night, whispering dreams into the darkness. Dreams we knew better than to speak aloud. Dreams of growing up, slowly, dreams of choosing our own lives, even though we had never seen that happen to any woman around us. Still, we dreamed because we were children, and children do not yet know what is about to be taken from them. The day my childhood ended did not arrive with violence. It arrived with words, calm, respectful words spoken by men who believed they were righteous. My father called us into the room where elders sat. My mother would not look at us. Her eyes were swollen and red, but she said nothing. I remember the smell of incense, the weight of seriousness pressing against my chest. My father spoke of honor and duty and obedience. He spoke of marriage as if it were a gift and not a sentence. The word nikah floated in the air and my mind could not hold it. Marriage was a future thing, something whispered about after a girl became a woman, not something that belonged to children who still played on the floor. When understanding finally reached me, my body froze. I was 8 years old. 8 years old when my father decided my body was no longer mine. I did not cry. I did not scream. I nodded because good daughters nod. Obedience had been carved into me deeper than instinct. That night my sister clung to me shaking, and I told her Allah would protect us, because that was the only comfort I knew how to give. But inside me a question was forming quietly, dangerously. Why did obedience feel like terror? Why did holiness feel like disappearing? Why did the God who counted stars not see 2 little girls holding each? Ya other in the dark, if you're listening to this, and something inside you feels familiar, if you were taught that silence is virtue and suffering is holy, please stay with me. And if stories like this matter to you, I ask you gently to subscribe, like, comment, and share. Not for me, but for those who are still hidden, still unheard, because this is how my childhood ended, and how my journey toward truth began, even though I did not know it yet. And the God I would one day meet was nothing like the God I feared. I tried to tell myself it was just a conversation. On just adults talking about the future like it was normal. But my stomach churned with a fear I did not have words for. At 8 years old, I watched my father's face carefully. He was calm and steady, and that made my fear worse because calm can be a weapon. My twin sister hid her face behind my shoulder, and I tried to squeeze her hand as if it could make us invisible. I remember the men talking about money, dowries, arrangements that seemed as though they were discussing land, not human lives. I wanted to understand. I wanted to nod. I wanted to be good, but inside me my heart raced. My chest tightened. My tiny throat closed over a scream. I did not know I was holding in. They spoke of honor and obedience as though our bodies belonged to tradition and not to us. I heard the word future repeated, as if the future was something given to the men and only lent briefly to us. I remember glancing at my mother, her eyes red and shiny from crying. Yet she said nothing, and her silence was louder than all the words in the room. I tried to memorize the expressions on their faces, as if I could use them later to protect us, but even that felt futile. My father's voice was calm, but every syllable carried the weight of decisions that would follow us forever. I thought I understood the world up to that moment. I thought obedience kept you safe. I thought faith kept you whole, but suddenly the ground beneath me seemed to crack. I could no longer trust the simple truths I had been raised to cling to. I kept my eyes on my sister and whispered small prayers under my breath, asking Allah to protect her, asking Allah to protect me, asking Allah to let the world pause so we could find safety. I did not know how fragile we were, and I did not know how little power a child can have in a world that calls you good when it breaks your life in two. Later I would remember every detail of that room, the incense burning in thick spirals, the polished wooden floor where I could almost see my own reflection, the harshness of the men's sandals on the floor, and the way the air seemed to press against me with judgment. I would remember my sister trembling beside me, and the silent question forming in my mind that would never go away. Why do the innocent suffer? Why do the faithful tremble? Why do those who pray first learn fear? I could not speak these words out loud. Yet they formed in my mind like fire. I imagined my own small body disappearing like smoke into the walls, imagining that no one could touch us if we ceased to exist. I clutched my sister's hand tighter, hoping some of my courage would rub off on her. I whispered over and over in her ear that we were safe, that Allah would protect us. And even though she squeezed my hand back, I knew neither of us believed it fully, because the eyes of the adults told a different story. Their calm authority masked a plan that would put us into marriages we could not understand or consent to. We were children, and yet we were being asked to step into a world of adult rules. I had no idea how to navigate. I did not even know what I was giving up. I only knew the word obedience, and I repeated it like a mantra to keep the terror at bay that night, when the elders finally left the room. My sister curled against me, sobbing quietly, and I held her small frame, whispering the only words I knew could comfort her. Allah will protect you. I will protect you. I will never let go. I tried to keep my own tears from falling because I believed even then that weakness was a sin. I tried to memorize the sound of her breathing, to remember it forever, because I had a foolish hope that if I could memorize enough of the world, it might stay safe for us. Somehow I did not sleep that night. I lay awake thinking of all the things I had learned about goodness and fear, and how they seemed to contradict each other. I thought of the faces of the men in the room and the silence of my mother, and I realized even then that the world I thought I knew was only a fragile mask, and that beneath it was a weight I could not yet understand that we would carry for the rest of our lives. The next morning the world felt the same, and yet everything had changed. My twin sister and I moved like shadows through the small rooms of our home, our feet barely touching the floor. I kept replaying the previous night in my mind, every word, every glance, every heavy breath of the adults, as if memorizing it could protect us from what came next. I looked at my sister's small face and wondered if she understood the weight of what had been spoken. I could feel it pressing against me like a heavy cloth, and yet I was expected to bow, smile, recite my prayers, and act as though nothing had happened. I remember sitting in the corner of the room trying to recite a surah. My lips moved, but my heart did not follow. I felt as if the words were hollow, empty shells. I wanted to scream that I was a child. I wanted to tell someone that we were 8 years old, and yet I had been handed futures that belonged to strangers. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The walls of our home were lined with the expectations of our family and community. The very air seemed to judge us. I remember glancing at the Quran on the shelf and wondering if Allah really knew how small we were, and if He knew that our lives were already being decided without our voices. I thought of my mother, whose eyes carried sadness and fear. I thought of my father, whose calm face had decided our fate. I felt betrayed in a way I did not yet have words for. And yet, I repeated the prayers I had been taught. I covered my hair. I lowered my gaze. I acted obedient and good, because that was the only weapon I had. I clutched my sister's hand and whispered small assurances, hoping they were true, even though my mind screamed that nothing was safe. Nothing was holy in the way I had been taught. I spent hours imagining what the future would feel like. imagining men's hands, strangers' voices, the strange world I would be forced into. I remembered our whispered dreams and the way our laughter had once filled the room, and I realized that laughter would soon be silenced. I realized that childhood had already slipped through my fingers like water. I wept quietly in the darkness of the early morning when no one could see me. I pressed my face into my hands and asked Allah why. Why had He allowed us to be so small in a world so cruel? I did not yet know that this question would follow me for decades, that it would gnaw at my faith and shape my every thought for years to come. I remembered the night I had held my sister and promised protection. I realized I had lied to her because there was no way I could protect us. I had no power yet. I pretended I did, as I had been taught, pretending. Made the fear more bearable, and yet it did not erase it. I remember thinking that maybe obedience was not always righteousness, that maybe holiness was not always safety, that perhaps the God I had been raised to fear was not the God who saw hearts. I thought about the other girls in the village whose lives were also planned before they could speak, and I felt a sorrow that made my chest ache. I thought of my twin sister's trembling body, and I made a silent vow that one day I would find a way to understand this world, that one day I would find a God who was not silent. I did not know when that would happen, or if it would be possible. I only knew that for the first time in my life a question had taken root inside me, a question that would not be silenced by prayers or obedience or fear, and that question was simple and terrifying. Is this really God? I spent the rest of the day moving through my small world, pretending to be happy, pretending to be righteous. But inside I felt a spark of something new, a tiny spark that whispered that maybe, just maybe, there could be a God who saw us, a God who would not allow the innocent to be crushed, a God who would rescue us in ways I could not yet imagine. And in that spark, I found the faintest glimmer of hope, the first small seed of courage, the beginning of a journey that would one day lead me to a love so pure and so real that it would heal every fear and every betrayal and every broken piece of my childhood. This is how my childhood ended, and how the story of Sawdah truly began. The day they told us we were to marry, I felt my stomach twist into knots that would not untangle my twin sister, and I were called once more into the same room where men sat with calm faces, as if the world outside us did not exist, as if childhood itself was a formality to be discarded. My father's voice was even softer than before, but every word carried a weight heavier than any hand could lift. We were to be brides to grown men, men whose faces I had never seen, and whose hands I was not meant to hold, and yet the words were spoken with such certainty that I had no choice but to understand that this was now my life. I looked at my sister, and she hid her face behind my small hands, trembling silently. I tried to squeeze her hand to give her courage, and to give myself courage at the same time, but it was fragile, like holding a bird in your palms. The men spoke of Allah's will, of honor, of righteousness, and I repeated the words silently in my mind as a shield, trying to convince myself that they meant safety, trying to convince myself that obedience could still protect us. I remembered the girls in the village who had married before us, their faces pale and silent as if they had been erased. I remembered the whispers of my mother telling us that this was tradition, that this was the way it had always been, that daughters belonged to men eventually. And I felt my heart harden with something like understanding and something like despair. I did not know how to reconcile the God I had been taught to love with the world I now saw around me. I remembered every surah I had memorized and felt their echoes hollow against the reality pressing down upon us. My sister whispered that she was scared, and I held her closer, whispering that we would pray that Allah would protect us. But even as I said the words, I did not know if I believed them. I watched the elders speak calmly about money and dowries and family honor, as though our bodies were currency, and I was 8 years old and trying to breathe. I felt tears burn in my eyes, but I blinked them away because I had learned that ye good girls do not cry in front of adults. I memorized the layout of the room, the polished wooden floor, the smell of incense that hung heavy in the air, the slight bend of my father's finger. When he gestured to one of the men, I memorized everything, because my tiny mind was desperate to hold on to any detail that might save us. I did not yet know that nothing in this world could protect children from grown men's decisions. I did not yet know that the word obedience could not shield us from what was coming that evening. When the arrangements were finalized, I lay on the mat with my sister pressed to me and imagined the future like a dark cloud. I imagined strange hands, strange voices, and a world that was no longer ours. I whispered over and over that Allah would protect us. I whispered that my father's heart would soften. I whispered that maybe I was not the end of everything, and yet inside me a quiet terror spread that would not be stilled. I thought about the adults' calm faces and realized that calm could be cruelty. I thought about the words of the Quran and realized that the verses I had memorized could not answer the questions forming in my mind. Questions about innocence, questions about love, questions about a God who would allow children to be given like property. I held my sister tight and tried to imagine escaping into the sky like the birds outside our window. But the world was closed in all directions. The walls pressed in the floor seemed to rise against us, and even the stars outside seemed indifferent. I realized then that childhood was not a place. It was a hope I had once carried, and now that hope was slipping through my fingers. I thought of the promises I had made to myself, that I would protect my sister, that I would survive, that I would not let the world erase us entirely. And I felt a spark of something dangerous, something that would follow me for years, a spark that whispered that I might one day find a God who would see us and care for us. And until then, I would have to carry this fear and this pain inside me, like a secret treasure, like a silent prayer that perhaps one day it could be answered. The days that followed were filled with whispered instructions and strange faces that belonged to men I had never seen before. My twin sister and I were led through rooms and houses as if we were objects to be examined for approval. And still, I did not cry, because I had learned that good girls do not cry in front of strangers or in front of the ones who hold your life in their hands. I watched my sister withdraw into herself, and I tried to shield her even as I felt my own body tighten with fear. Every conversation about honor or obedience was a knife pressed against my small chest. I heard the words of the Quran repeated over and over as justification, and my mind could not understand how verses that spoke of mercy could be used to explain our terror. I memorized the men's faces, their eyes scanning us, as if we were questions to be answered rather than children to be protected. I remembered the weight of my father's gaze and the faint line of a smile he offered when the arrangements were finalized, and I felt a betrayal so deep I could not name it. Yet I repeated prayers under my breath. Each time a new man approached or a new word was spoken, I covered my hair tightly and lowered my gaze and told myself that obedience could still be our shield, that if I did not fight, we might survive intact, but each day brought reminders that survival was fragile, that tradition could crush even the most faithful, that childhood could be taken, like sand slipping through small fingers. I spent hours lying awake at night, counting the shadows on the walls, and imagining what the future would demand of us. I thought of our neighbors' daughters, whose eyes were dull with early marriage, whose voices were soft and cautious. And I understood that our world was not designed for children like us to grow up free. I felt my own small body shrink in response to this realization. And yet, I whispered to my sister that we would endure, that Allah would protect us, and that somehow, we would remain together, even if the world wanted to separate us. I began noticing how people's eyes changed when they looked at us, how the tone of their voice implied ownership rather than care, how the word obedience was repeated as though it were a mantra to hide the cruelty behind it, and I realized that this was how the world worked in our village, how religion could be used to justify what would otherwise be called abuse. And I felt a small, dangerous spark of anger in me that I did not dare to name. I memorized every step, every sound, and every breath as if storing it in my mind could give us power to survive. The first night of the wedding loomed like a shadow over me, and I could not stop thinking of it, imagining the strange hands, the strange voices, the strange world my tiny body was being forced into. I whispered over and over that Allah would protect us, and yet I felt the spark of a question that had begun months ago flicker brighter inside me, a question that dared to ask if the God I had been taught to love could be silent while children were given like property. I clutched my sister's hand and whispered assurances I did not fully believe, because I had learned that sometimes words are all you have against a world that does not see the small or the innocent, and yet even in my fear a small part of me began to dream quietly that maybe there could be a God who saw us, who and would not allow us to be broken, who would notice our trembling bodies and whisper that we were loved. And even as the wedding night approached and the village seemed to close in around us, I carried that spark like a secret treasure tucked deep inside my chest, a spark that would not allow me to disappear completely, and that would follow me for years, and perhaps save me one day from everything I feared would consume us. The night before the wedding stretched endlessly around us. The shadows in our small room seemed to grow taller and heavier. My sister pressed herself against me trembling, and I held her as if my tiny arms could keep the world away. I whispered words I did not fully believe, that Allah would protect us, that we would survive, that perhaps the world could not take everything from us. Yet even as I said them, I felt the weight of what I was coming settle into my chest like a stone. I remembered all the times I had been taught. Obedience is holiness, that fear is discipline, that silence is virtue, and I felt a dangerous doubt creeping into my heart, because I realized that nothing I had learned could protect us from the reality we were about to face. I lay awake, counting the breaths of my sister, and trying to imagine the night would pass quickly, imagining that somehow morning would bring a miracle that would keep us whole. I thought about the men whose hands would soon be near us, and I shivered imagining the strange shapes of their shadows on the floor, imagining the sound of their voices giving orders. I thought of my father's calm face, and I could not reconcile it with the betrayal I felt deep inside me. I began questioning everything I had ever been taught about faith, about obedience, about goodness. I wondered how a God who claimed to see all could allow children to be treated as property, and my chest tightened with a pain that was both fear and fury. I whispered silent prayers begging for a miracle. I closed my eyes and imagined running away, imagined the wind lifting us into the sky, but I knew there was nowhere to go. The walls pressed in the floor seemed to rise to meet me, and even the stars outside seemed indifferent. I thought about the girls in the village who had been given away before us, their voices quieted, their laughter stolen, and I realized that we were now part of a long chain of broken childhoods. And yet, even in my fear, a tiny spark of courage flickered inside me. I held my sister's hand and whispered that we would endure, and that we would not lose ourselves entirely, even if the world tried to claim. I remembered the small prayers I had whispered over and over since childhood, the verses I had memorized, and I realized that even though they did not answer my questions, they had given me a framework for hope. I began imagining a God who could be different from the one I had been taught to fear, a God who would see us, who would care for us, who would notice our trembling bodies and say that we were loved, even as the wedding night approached and the village seemed to close in around us. I clutched my sister tighter and made a silent vow that no matter what happened, we would survive together, that no matter how cruel the world was, we would not let it erase the bond we had. And in that vow, I felt the first tiny glimmer of rebellion, not loud, not violent, but a quiet inner defiance that whispered that maybe, just maybe, and we could hold on to our souls, even as the world tried to take everything else from us. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, I knew that nothing in our world would ever be the same again, that the shadow of the wedding night would follow us forever, and that the question forming in my heart would not be silenced, a question that asked if there could be a God who would rescue us, a God who would see children like us, and that question would follow me for years, a question that would one day lead me to a truth and a love I had not yet imagined. And that is how the days before our first night as child brides passed, and how the fear that would define my early life began to take root deep inside me, a fear that was also the seed of a courage I did not yet understand. The days after our wedding blurred into an endless cycle of fear and quiet obedience. My twin sister became almost a ghost beside me, retreating further into herself, while I carried a weight. I did not yet have a word for every word spoken over us. Every verse recited felt like a blade cloaked in holiness, and I learned quickly that saying nothing and smiling meant survival, that hiding inside your mind was the only place left to breathe. The men treated us with the calm certainty of ownership, as if we were objects to be trained rather than children to be protected. I memorized every glance, every movement, every tone, because I believed if I could predict their actions, perhaps I could shield my sister and myself. I began noticing how the Quran was used around us, verses about obedience and modesty recited like weapons to control my body and my thoughts. And at first, I believed that the pain and fear were part of my own failing, that Perhaps I had not been good enough, that perhaps Allah was punishing me for small lapses in prayer or in humility. I whispered apologies to God in the dark corners of our room, repeating the surahs I had memorized since childhood, as if repetition could erase the terror I felt, as if obeying perfectly might bring mercy or release, but it never did. I watched my sister grow quiet and pale, her eyes staring into nothing, while I held her hands and whispered assurances. I barely believed myself that we were safe, that we would survive, that this would not break us completely. And yet, each night the weight of what we endured pressed harder on our chests. I began to hear my own thoughts as whispers of doubt, questions that terrified me. What kind of God allows children to suffer? What kind of holiness demands silence in the face of pain? What kind of faith teaches obedience while the innocent are harmed? And I hated myself for even thinking these thoughts, for daring to question a God I had been taught to love and fear. At the same time, every prayer I whispered felt hollow. Yet I could not stop praying. I could not stop clinging to fragments of the teachings I had learned, because they were the only framework I had for understanding the world. And yet, each verse I recited now echoed differently in my mind. I began noticing contradictions between what I was told and what I lived. The quiet that surrounded us at night was filled with whispers of doubt, and the small, trembling spark of fear became a flame inside me, a flame that asked if obedience was truly righteousness, if fear was truly faith, if holiness was truly protection. My sister withdrew more with each passing day. I could see her spirit shrinking, and I could not save her. I could only hold her hand and pray silently that we would not be completely lost, that somehow there was a God who would hear our hearts, and not just the words of the men who ruled our lives. The first time I whispered aloud in my mind the question that had been forming for months, I asked softly, so no one could hear, "Is this really God?" And even saying it felt like sin, yet it was the first time I felt a faint spark of defiance, a spark that perhaps, if nurtured, and could survive everything the world had planned for us. And though I still acted obedient during the day and memorized the verses I had been taught to love, the truth was buried in my heart and mind that something about the God I had been raised to fear did not feel right, that something about the way holiness was wielded in our lives was wrong, and that perhaps there was another God out there, a God who saw the innocent, a God who would hear the cries we could not speak aloud. And I held on to that tiny thought like a secret treasure deep inside me, because it was the only thing that felt like hope. The mornings blurred into a suffocating rhythm of silence and ritual. My sister rarely spoke anymore, and when she did, it was only in whispers that I strained to hear, while I carried the weight of both our fears and tried to speak words of comfort. I barely believed myself. Each day brought new reminders of our helplessness. The Quran was recited over us with solemnity that made every command feel heavier than my small body could bear. The verses that had once filled me with pride now seemed to mock me as I struggled to obey perfectly. Even as the terror seeped into my bones, I found myself apologizing to Allah for things I could not control, for the trembling of my body, for the thoughts that dared to rise unbidden, for the way my heart longed for safety and love that was denied to us. And the men's calm voices loomed over us like judges who had already decided our worth by how quietly we endured their presence. I memorized every glance, every gesture, every inflection, because I believed if I could predict them, I might find a way to survive and perhaps protect my sister. But each night, the pain, I returned with a new weight that left me hollow inside. I started to question everything I had been taught about faith, about obedience, about holiness. The rules that had once seemed unshakable now felt like cages, and yet I whispered the surahs and covered my hair and lowered my gaze because even in doubt, I had nowhere else to turn, and my mind turned quietly to the idea that maybe Allah was not watching. Maybe the God I had learned to fear was silent in the face of suffering. Maybe the power I had trusted to protect us was absent. And when I dared to even think such thoughts, my chest tightened with guilt and terror. I told myself I was sinful, and yet the questions would not go away. Why do the innocent suffer? Why do the faithful tremble? Why do children pay for the sins of adults? I watched my sister shrink more with each passing day, her eyes hollow. On an instant her laughter extinguished, and I felt a grief so heavy I wanted to disappear along with her. I whispered to her that we would survive, that Allah would protect us. that someday things would be different, and I clung to those words as much as I clung to her small hand, even as my heart whispered that survival alone might not be enough, that we were losing pieces of ourselves every day, that the world could take everything and leave only fear behind. And yet, in that darkness, I felt a spark of something fragile and new, a tiny flicker of defiance that whispered, maybe there was a God who did see us, a God who would notice the trembling hearts of children, and a God who would not allow our innocence to be crushed forever. And I held on to that spark like a secret treasure deep inside me, because it was the only thing that felt like hope in a world that had otherwise offered none. And though I acted obedient during the day and repeated the verses I had been taught to love, the truth grew quietly in my heart that the God I had been raised to fear might not be the God I needed, and that perhaps the answers I sought could be found beyond the words that had once bound me. Night fell and brought no rest. My sister curled against me as I lay awake listening to the soft sounds of the house, the wind brushing against the walls and the distant calls of evening prayers. The quiet that should have felt peaceful instead pressed down on my chest, and I realized that the fear I carried was no longer just about the men or the rules or the expectations. It had grown into a weight that seemed to touch every part of me. Every thought, every breath, every heartbeat. I whispered small prayers under my breath, and asking Allah to protect us, asking Him to soften our lives, to take the terror away, to make our bodies safe, to make our hearts safe. And the silence that followed was louder than any answer I could imagine. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I did not let them fall, because even in this darkness, I had been taught that crying was weakness, that faith required endurance, and yet the questions inside me would not be silenced. They grew louder with every breath. Why do the innocent suffer? Why does the faithful tremble? Why do children endure pain that cannot be explained? Why does the God I love and fear remain silent? I held my sister's hand and whispered over and over that we would survive, that we were strong, that we would endure, even though I could not believe it fully, and for the first time I whispered aloud in my mind the words that had been forming slowly for months, a question so fragile and terrifying that I almost did not say it. Is this really God? And saying it felt like sin, and yet it felt like truth. A spark ignited in me, a tiny flame of defiance and hope, that maybe the God I had been taught to fear was not the only God, that maybe somewhere beyond the silence, there was a God who saw our trembling bodies, who heard our quiet prayers, who would not allow children to be broken by obedience and tradition. I held onto that spark like a secret treasure. I whispered it again and again in my mind, as I imagined a God who would not only see us, but love us, who would not demand obedience through fear, who would welcome our hearts, even when our bodies were taken by others. And though I still obeyed during the day, and recited the verses I had been taught to love, the truth in my heart was, and growing quietly unstoppable, that the world I had known was not the only world, that faith could be something more than silence and fear, that hope could exist even in the shadow of terror. I pressed my face into my sister's hair and felt her trembling slowly fade into sleep, and in that moment I allowed myself a tiny flicker of courage, a belief that perhaps one day we could be free from everything that had been stolen from us. And perhaps one day I would find a God who would answer the questions I had been too afraid to ask aloud for so long. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, I carried that spark with me like a hidden flame, knowing it would follow me for years, and that it would one day lead me to the truth I had been seeking since childhood. And that is how the days of hidden abuse, the silence, the prayers, the fear, and the first seeds of doubt passed, and how the first whispered question in my heart became the beginning of a journey that would eventually lead me toward a God whose love and truth could never be silenced. The morning started like any other, but the world I had known no longer made sense. I woke to a silence that felt heavier than usual. My sister's side of the mat was empty, and my heart skipped a beat before I remembered that she had been taken to another house by our father under the pretense of family obligation. I ran to her room but found only the cold emptiness of absence. The walls that had always felt familiar now seemed to mock me with their indifference. I called her name, but the echo returned nothing, and for the first time I felt the fragile belief I had carried crumble completely. I fell to my knees and whispered a prayer that sounded hollow even to my Ye own ears. Allah, please protect us. Allah, please bring her back. Allah, please hear me. And the only answer was silence, a silence so complete that my ears seemed to ring with it. I had followed every rule memorized, every verse recited, every surah perfectly. I had bowed at every prayer, lowered my gaze and covered my hair, and yet all that obedience had not saved my sister, had not saved me, had not protected our bodies, our hearts, our souls. I felt betrayal rise in my chest like a fire I could not contain, and the thought that perhaps nothing I had been taught was true pressed into me with every heartbeat. I remembered every sermon, every lesson, every teaching about submission, about obedience, about faith, and I felt a deep and burning anger at the God I had been taught to fear, at the men who had decided our lives, and at my own helplessness. I paced the small room trying to make sense of it, trying to beg the world to make sense, to make it safe. And nothing did. The Quran verses I had memorized for comfort now felt empty, hollow, meaningless. I tried to pray harder, whisper faster, and recite louder, but the silence remained absolute. I felt tears slide down my cheeks, and I allowed myself to cry for the first time without restraint. I cried for my sister, for my stolen childhood, for my broken trust for a God who did not seem to answer. I remembered every lesson about patience, about enduring suffering, about trusting Allah, and I felt the weight of betrayal deepen, because I had followed those lessons, and yet nothing had changed. Nothing had protected me or my sister. I started noticing all the contradictions that had always been there, hidden in plain sight. How obedience and faith were praised but did not bring protection. How mercy was promised but pain arrived instead. How holiness was defined by silence and suffering. And I realized in that moment that fear had been worshipped as faith and suffering had been worshipped as virtue. I felt my small body shake uncontrollably as the enormity of what had happened pressed down on me. I whispered a desperate plea that perhaps any God would hear me, not the God of fear, the God I had been raised to obey, but any God who would see me. Who would care? Who would respond to the silent cries of a child? And in the hours that followed, I watched my own faith unravel piece by piece, every certainty that had guided me since childhood, crumbling into dust. I felt the terror of being lost in a world without guidance, without protection. And yet, in that darkness, a tiny spark began to flicker. I did not yet know it was Jesus. I only knew that I was begging for an answer that would not come, that I was desperate for a presence that could see me, that I was willing to question everything I had been taught for a chance at mercy, for a chance at love, for a chance at life. And as night fell, I clutched my sister's absence like a physical weight and whispered to the dark that I could no longer believe the words I had memorized, the rituals I had obeyed, the verses I had recited, the silence around me. That was absolute. But inside I felt a trembling awareness that perhaps God was not the one I had known. Perhaps there was someone else listening, someone who would see my heart and hear my cries, and that realization filled me with both terror and the faintest spark of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, I could survive this broken world and be answered at last. The days that followed my sister's absence felt like an endless echo of despair. I moved through the house like a shadow, pretending to obey, pretending that everything was as it had always been, but inside me, my heart was hollowed by a truth I could no longer deny. Every prayer I whispered seemed to vanish into the air without answer. Every surah I recited felt like a lie. My obedience had not saved us, and the adults around me treated the world as if nothing had changed, as if children being taken and given away like objects was ordinary and righteous. And I could not stop asking myself why I had been taught to fear and obey, when that fear brought no protection, when that obedience could not save us from harm. I remembered the quiet moments with my sister before she was taken, and how we had held each other like lifelines. And I realized that even our bond could not shield us completely from the cruelty of the world, and the weight of that knowledge pressed into me until I could hardly breathe. I began noticing contradictions that had always been there. In the lessons I had learned, the words that promised mercy, yet delivered fear, the verses that spoke of justice, yet allowed the innocent to suffer, the promises of a God who loved, yet remained silent when I needed him most. And I began to feel a dangerous anger growing inside me, an anger that was tangled with sorrow and fear and confusion. And yet, it was the first time I felt the stirrings of awareness that perhaps the God I had been taught to obey was not the only God. Perhaps there was a presence somewhere who would not remain silent, who would see the trembling hearts of children and answer even when no one else would. I fasted and prayed with all the force of my small body and mind. But the silence was absolute, and each night I lay awake, counting the breaths I no longer shared with my sister. I whispered desperate pleas into the dark, begging. And for any answer, for any sign that someone somewhere heard me, that someone cared, that someone was watching over us. And the more silence there was, the more I began to see clearly that the rituals, the verses, the obedience that had defined my life were not enough, that they had never been enough, and that perhaps faith was not in silence, but in being heard and seen. I began to wonder if it was wrong to hope, if it was wrong to question, if it was wrong to feel that my prayers were not answered by the God I had been taught to worship, and the thought terrified me, because questioning had always been forbidden. Questioning had always been sin, and yet inside me, the questions would not die. Why do the innocent suffer? Why does the faithful tremble? Why does God remain silent when children are broken? And I whispered the words into the darkness, and felt a small tremor of courage in my chest, that perhaps asking was the first step toward being seen, perhaps crying aloud in my heart was the first step toward finding a God who would answer. Perhaps the spark that flickered inside me was the beginning of a journey toward something real and loving and alive, and though fear still pressed into my chest, I began to feel that spark growing, that small, trembling flame that whispered that maybe, just maybe, and I could survive the brokenness around me, and that somewhere there was a presence listening. Somewhere there was a God who would not allow our lives to be consumed by silence and terror, and that realization filled me with both dread and a fragile hope that perhaps my prayers could be heard, even when the world remained silent. Night came again and brought no comfort. My sister still gone, the house filled with the quiet of people pretending nothing had changed. I pressed my small hands to my face and whispered every prayer I could remember, every surah, every word of obedience I had memorized since childhood, and yet the silence pressed heavier than ever before. I wept quietly into my palms, and for the first time allowed myself to feel the full weight of despair, the betrayal of faith, the emptiness of obedience. I questioned everything I had been taught, every lesson, every verse, every warning of punishment, and my mind refused to rest. Even as my body shook with exhaustion, I tried to recite the Quran to make sense of it, to find protection, to find comfort, but the words felt hollow and distant, and I realized that the God I had been taught to fear was silent, while the world around me punished the innocent. And I could not understand why I had been raised to obey when obedience brought no safety, when fear brought no protection, when every ritual I followed left me hollow and trembling. I remembered my sister's eyes before she was taken, the way she had clung to me, and how we had promised to protect each other. And the bitter truth settled deep inside me that even that bond could not shield us from the cruelty of adults, or the rules of tradition, or the silence of God. I fell to my knees and whispered a prayer that was neither recitation nor memorization. It was raw, it was desperate, it was a child reaching for any presence that might exist, and I said aloud in the quiet of the empty room, "Please someone hear me, please answer me. Please show me that I'm not forgotten." And for a moment nothing came, and then I felt a trembling inside me, a stirring like a whisper moving beneath my chest, a sensation I could not name, a presence that felt at once terrifying and gentle, a warmth that wrapped around my soul and made my tears feel safe. And I realized in that moment that I was no longer praying to the God I had been taught to fear. I was praying to anyone who would answer, anyone who would see me. And the thought both frightened and comforted me, because I did not know what it meant, or what would happen next. I curled into a ball on the floor and let the silence press in around me. And yet, inside that silence, I felt something new, a faint spark of recognition, that perhaps my prayers could be heard, that perhaps the God I had known was not the only God, that perhaps there was someone, who would not remain silent, who would not abandon the trembling hearts of children. And I held on to that spark, as if it were the only thing in the world that could keep me alive. As the night deepened and shadows stretched across the walls, I whispered into the darkness that I was ready to listen, that I was ready for someone to answer, that I was willing to trust, even if it meant fear, even if it meant loss, even if it meant everything I had ever known was gone. And in that desperate readiness, I felt a trembling certainty that I was no longer alone, that something had heard me, that something was coming, and that the spark of hope that had flickered so quietly inside me for years was about to ignite into a light I could not yet see. And that is how the days of silence and betrayal reached their breaking point, and how the first true stirrings of and divine presence began to touch my heart and soul, setting the stage for a God who would not leave me in darkness, and who would soon reveal himself in ways I had never imagined. I woke that night to a light that did not belong to the moon or the stars, a gentle glow that filled the room without burning it. And for a moment, I could not breathe, my small body frozen in the middle of the mat, as if the air itself had grown heavy around me. And then I saw him. His eyes were the first thing I noticed, soft and piercing at the same time, full of a depth I had never known. I could not name him. I did not yet know his name, but something inside me recognized the gaze, and my heart, which had been hollowed by fear and despair, I began to beat in a way I had never felt before. I tried to speak, but no words came. My lips moved and nothing emerged, and yet he smiled, and it was not a smile of judgment, but of understanding, of seeing, of acceptance. And I felt a warmth flood through me, a sensation so foreign that my fear wavered just enough for me to wonder if I was dreaming, or if this was something real. And his voice came not through sound, but through a knowing that reached into the corners of my mind and soul. "Sawdah," he said softly, "I have seen you. I know your pain. I have not abandoned you." I trembled so violently that I thought my small body might shatter. Yet the fear was mixed with awe, with something I could only describe as peace, a peace that I had never felt in the long nights of prayer and silence. I wanted to ask if this was right, if this was forbidden, if the world would punish me for even thinking of him. But the words died in my throat, because I felt that he already knew every thought, every doubt, every whispered plea I had ever sent into the darkness, and it did not frighten him, it did not repel him. It drew him closer. I could feel his presence pressing softly against the walls of my chest, like a promise that I could survive, that I could endure, that I was not alone. And then I saw my sister in my mind's eye, small and trembling, and I felt the urge to protect her, to shield her and his presence. Seemed to embrace even that desire, and he said, "I am with you. You are never alone." I wanted to cry and laugh and scream all at once, but my body could not do more than tremble and whisper his name silently, because I did not yet know it fully. And then he stretched out his hand, not to touch but to guide, and I felt a stirring in my heart like a seed cracking open in the soil, and I thought perhaps this was what hope felt like. Perhaps this was what it meant to be seen by someone who loved completely. And I realized in that moment that every prayer I had whispered that had returned, only silence had not been in vain, that my heart had been reaching for him all along, that the spark of courage and defiance and longing that had carried me through nights of fear and pain was now drawing me toward a love I had never imagined, and I could not name him. Yet I knew somehow that he was real, that he was listening, and that he was beginning a work in me that would change everything. And I stayed on the mat trembling for hours until the glow faded into the quiet darkness. And I dared to move my small hands, only to find that the fear had softened, that a new sense of peace had begun to take root, that the silence was not empty, but filled with presence. And I whispered into the night that I did not understand everything, that I was afraid of what might come, but that I would listen, that I would follow even in the darkness. And I felt, for the first time in my life, that perhaps God was not silent, and that a love I could scarcely name had begun to claim the hollow spaces inside me, filling them with a warmth I had never known. And as sleep finally took me, it was no longer fear that pressed on my chest, but a trembling anticipation that something was coming that would change everything, and that I would never be the same again. The next morning I awoke with a trembling in my chest, a sensation I had never known before, as if something in the night had shifted the air around me. The light was gone, the glow vanished, but the presence lingered inside me, heavy and insistent, like a quiet pulse in my heart I could not ignore. I sat on the mat and touched my hands, as if they might tell me what had truly happened, and I realized I could not deny it. Something real had come to me, something gentle yet powerful, on something that saw all the pain and whispered that I was not alone. I remembered every night of fear, every whispered prayer that had returned nothing, and for the first time I felt that those silent pleas had been reaching toward something greater, something that had answered even when I could not hear. I wanted to speak about it, to tell someone, but fear clenched my small chest. The fear of my father, of the elders, of the punishment that could come if anyone discovered that I had felt something beyond their rules, and so I kept it secret, clutching it to my heart like a fragile treasure. I began to search for him quietly, secretly, when no one could see, finding an old phone hidden in the house and downloading an app I had heard whispers about. A small glowing book called the Bible. I opened it with trembling fingers. I'm afraid that even touching it might be forbidden, and yet drawn by a pull I could not resist. The words on the screen were strange and yet familiar, soft and alive, as if they were speaking directly to my soul. I read of Jesus, his mercy, his love, his presence with the weak and the broken, and the tears I had held back for so long began to spill freely. I whispered every verse aloud under my breath, memorizing them as I had memorized the Quran. But these words did not feel heavy or punitive. They felt like air, like water, like a hand lifting the weight from my chest. I hid the device in my small hands whenever anyone came near, reading secretly, trembling with fear and awe at the same time. Every sentence seemed to pierce the fear that had gripped me since my sister was taken. Every verse whispered a promise that I had not known could exist. And yet fear remained, because I knew this was forbidden, because I knew that even this truth could be punished, and I wrestled with the risk, with the cost. My tiny heart beat wildly as I read about a God who called me by name, who promised to see the hidden, the forgotten, the abused and the lonely, and I could not believe it fully, but I felt it. I could feel a presence in the room, not of walls or shadows, but of something living, something soft yet firm, and I whispered to it, "If you are real, if you see me, guide me, protect me, let me not be lost." And the silence that followed was not empty but charged, vibrating through my chest and filling me with a trembling anticipation, a sense that something greater than fear was near. And I closed my eyes and imagined the Jesus of the verses reaching out, taking my trembling hands in his, not to punish, not to scold, but to reassure, to heal, to see. My mind raced, caught between terror and devotion, wondering if what I was feeling was truly allowed, truly real, truly safe, and yet I could not deny it. Each secret reading, each whispered verse, each trembling heartbeat brought me closer to a knowledge I had never been taught, a love I had never imagined, and a hope I had long forgotten. I began to understand that faith could exist beyond fear, that obedience did not have to be rooted in terror, that a God could listen, respond, and heal. And even as the fear of my father's eyes, the elders' judgment, and the community's wrath pressed upon me, I felt a strange, fragile courage growing inside me. A courage that whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, I could believe, I could follow, I could trust, even if I did not yet understand everything. I lay back on the mat that night, Bible clutched to my chest, trembling yet alive, and whispered into the quiet room that I was listening, that I would follow, that I was ready to see what this love, this presence, this God could do. And for the first time since my childhood was stolen, I felt the faintest pulse of hope surge through me, as though a light had finally found a way into the shadowed corners of my soul. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I held the small device tightly to my chest, feeling its warmth as if it carried a heartbeat of its own, and I whispered into the darkness, "If you are real, show me, guide me, protect me." The fear of being caught, and of my father or the elders discovering what I was doing, pressed against my chest like a stone. But the longing inside me, the tremor of hope, was stronger. I opened the Bible once more, my fingers trembling over the glowing words, and I read passages about mercy and love, about Jesus calling the weak, the broken, the frightened, and the forsaken. And I could not stop the tears that poured silently down my face. Each word felt alive, each verse a whisper from him, a presence I could not see but could feel pressing gently into the hollow spaces of my soul. My heart raced as I imagined his eyes looking at me, not with judgment but with understanding, and I realized that this was a love I had never known, a God who did not demand fear but gave strength, who did not punish with silence but responded with presence. I thought of my sister. I'm far away in another home, trembling and alone, and I prayed for her too, asking that she might find this same light, this same peace, and I felt a trembling warmth spread through my chest, soft and insistent, as if the prayers themselves were heard before they even left my lips. I tried to speak, to say the words aloud, but my small voice caught in my throat, fear of punishment mingling with awe, yet I whispered them in my mind, each syllable a secret bridge between me and the presence that held me in that room. I remembered every moment of fear, every night of trembling, every time my heart had begged for mercy, and I realized that all of it had led me here, to a God who was real, who had been listening even when the world remained silent. My body shook with the intensity of it, the overwhelming sensation of being seen, of being known, and of being loved despite the darkness and pain I had endured, and I could not help but wonder if this was what true hope felt like. I stayed like that for hours, awake yet enveloped in a peace I had never imagined, torn between the terror of being caught and the impossible, undeniable beauty of his presence, and I whispered a vow inside my heart that I would follow, that I would listen, that I would seek this love even if the cost was everything I had ever known, even if it meant facing the wrath of my father, the scorn of my community, the risk of losing all that I had been taught to value. And in that long, trembling night, I felt a seed plant itself deep in the soil of my soul, fragile yet alive, a seed that carried the promise of strength, of courage, of a love that could never be stolen, a seed that whispered that I was not abandoned, that my childhood had not been erased, that even in the shadow of fear I could walk toward light, that even in the silence of my old prayers, someone had heard me all along, and for the first time since I had been taken from the innocence of my home, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could be saved, and that belief, small and trembling, carried me into a sleep filled with the quiet, overwhelming certainty that my life would never be the same again, that I had touched a God who would never let me go, and that the journey I was beginning would demand everything of me, and yet give me everything I had been longing for in secret, in shadows, and in whispered prayers that had finally found their answer. The days after that night were filled with a tension I had never known before. My heart carried a secret, fragile flame, and in my mind raced constantly between awe, fear, and the weight of what it might cost me to follow what I had glimpsed. Every glance from my father, every passing word from the elders, every whispered comment in the house reminded me of the dangers that could befall me if anyone discovered the truth I had begun to hold close. I hid the Bible under my mat, reading in secret during moments when no one could see, trembling with both fear and longing, and with every verse I read, the spark inside me grew, a strange mix of courage and terror that pushed against my ribs and demanded attention. I thought constantly of my sister, of how her fear and withdrawal mirrored my own before the encounter. And I prayed silently that somehow she would survive this world of rules and obedience, and that perhaps one day she too would know that love existed beyond the terror I had known. Every night I knelt on the floor of our small room, whispering prayers to Jesus, the name still unfamiliar yet comforting, and I wrestled with the reality that if anyone discovered my faith, if my father or the community knew, my life could be destroyed. Fear became my constant companion, but alongside it a new awareness grew that my obedience to fear and tradition could no longer define me, that the God I had glimpsed demanded trust, not trembling silence. I watched online sermons secretly, using the phone I had hidden, listening to other voices sharing experiences, testimonies of people who had faced persecution and survived. And each story stirred something inside me, a mix of longing, hope, and courage that was both exhilarating and terrifying. My sister began to notice small changes in me, her eyes questioning, cautious, and I realized I could not share the truth with her yet, not fully, because the risk was too great and her fear was palpable. But even her presence reminded me of what was at stake and strengthened the flame that had begun to grow inside my heart. I prayed directly to Jesus with words I had not spoken to anyone else, confessing my fear, my confusion, my longing for guidance, and each time I did, the trembling inside me shifted, as if his presence was softening the terror, replacing it with a strange courage, a fragile sense that I could choose something more than obedience to fear. And I began to notice my own body carrying tension and relief simultaneously, that even in hiding, even in fear, I felt a quiet joy when I whispered his name, when I read his words, when I allowed myself to imagine a life guided by his presence and not by terror or tradition. And yet, the cost loomed constantly in my mind, the threats unspoken yet understood. My father's rage, the elders' judgment, my sister used as leverage, the community that would shun or punish me, all pressing on my chest like stones, and I realized that to follow this God, to believe in him openly, could mean losing everything I had ever known. Each night I lay awake trembling, holding the Bible close, praying silently, and asking for strength, asking for courage, asking for guidance, and in that quiet, forbidden communion, I felt something shift inside me. On a resolve forming, fragile yet stubborn, a willingness to choose truth over safety, to trust in a God I had glimpsed, even if it meant walking a path of fear and loss. And I began to understand that the first step was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward in spite of it, to allow the spark of hope and love to grow inside me even when everything in the world told me to obey fear instead. And I knew then that whatever came next, I could not turn back, because my heart had already been touched by a presence that would not leave me, that would follow me, that would demand my courage and offer me everything I had longed for in the quiet, hidden spaces of my life. The following weeks felt like walking on a tightrope suspended over a chasm I could not see, every step trembling, every breath measured, because the spark inside me was growing brighter and could not be hidden for long. I noticed how my small gestures had changed, the way I lingered on words of kindness in the Bible, the way I refused to obey commands that demanded fear over love. And I saw the shadows in my sister's eyes when she looked at me. She whispered questions I could not answer, worried glances that pressed upon my chest as heavily as my father's unspoken threats, and I felt torn between sharing the truth with her and protecting her from a reality she was not yet ready to face. My heart ached as I realized that even though she was my twin, bound by blood and childhood, the choices I was making could separate us, could make her fear me, could make her hate me for stepping into something she did not yet understand. And I watched her retreat further into silence while I read hidden passages of the Bible, listened to online sermons late at night, and prayed aloud when no one could hear, and I could feel a transformation inside me that was undeniable. I was no longer just surviving. I was beginning to live in a new way, one that terrified me as much as it thrilled me. The fear of discovery became sharper, every glance from my father or an elder a knife on my heart, every whisper about family honor, every story about punishment for disobedience pressed on me like a constant drumbeat of dread. And yet, despite all of it, I could not stop listening, could not stop reading, could not stop feeling the gentle, persistent presence that had found me in the darkest night. I began to pray with more courage, even if silently, asking Jesus to give me strength, to protect my sister and me, to help me hold this secret without being discovered. And I felt the small flame inside me grow, warming my heart, even while terror wrapped its fingers around my ribs. Each day I moved through the household with careful steps, hiding my readings, hiding my whispers, hiding the very beat of my heart that seemed now to belong to another world. And I felt the tension of the dual life pressing against my body, heavy and exhausting, but also exhilarating in a way I had never known. I realized that every act of obedience to fear, every small survival tactic, had been training me for this moment, for the careful, deliberate choice to follow love, even when it demanded courage beyond my years. My sister's silence began to weigh on me more than my own fear, and I wanted desperately to reach her, and to show her that there was something more than the terror that had defined our lives. But I did not know how, and I could not risk revealing my secret too soon. I began to pray not just for myself, but for her heart to be opened, for her eyes to see the spark I had found, and every night I whispered her name alongside mine, asking for guidance, asking for protection, asking for courage. The days blurred into nights filled with secret study, trembling anticipation, and silent worship, and I began to notice subtle changes in my own heart. The way I smiled at the small beauty of sunlight, the way I felt hope for the first time in years, the way the fear of punishment no longer had the same hold over me because I had something stronger, a presence in my soul that demanded trust and courage more than fear. And yet, the danger remained. On pressing closer with every glance, every whispered word, every lesson about obedience and shame and honor that the elders forced upon us. And I knew that one misstep could expose me, could unravel everything, could crush the fragile seed that had been planted in my heart, the night I first felt his presence. I wrestled constantly with the reality of the world around me and the reality of the God inside me. And I prayed for clarity, for courage, for a way to navigate both without losing myself. And in the quiet moments when I was alone, when I could whisper and read and pray, I felt that spark grow into a flame, a light inside me that would not be extinguished even by fear or threats or the weight of my father's expectations. And I realized that I had begun the journey of choosing truth over safety, that I had begun to walk the narrow path that would demand everything of me, that would test my courage and my heart at every step, but that also promised something the world could not take, a love, a presence, and a hope that was mine and mine alone, and that even in the darkest hours, even when my sister could not yet see it, I knew that this flame would guide me, protect me, and eventually, if God willed it, lead us both into freedom. Days passed, and the spark inside me had grown into a flame that could no longer be hidden by careful steps or whispered prayers. My small acts of defiance, the way I lingered over verses, the gentle peace I carried in my chest, even when fear pressed against me, began to be noticed. My father's eyes lingered too long when I refused to obey the harsher demands of our household. And the elders murmured behind closed doors, questioning the quiet strength that had settled over me. Even my twin sister began to glance at me differently, curiosity and fear mingling in her eyes. And though she could not yet understand, I could see that something in me had changed in a way that could not be ignored. I felt exhilaration and terror in equal measure, knowing that each day could bring discovery, punishment, and shame, and yet I could not turn back. The love I had glimpsed that night, the presence I had felt in the glow that had filled my room, had claimed my heart and demanded that I act with courage, that I move through the fear without letting it define me. I prayed more boldly, even in secret, whispering words of surrender, of hope, of courage, asking Jesus to give me strength, to protect my sister, to guide my steps. And with each prayer, I felt the tremor of fear soften just enough to make space for faith. I began to carry myself differently, my posture more upright, my voice softer yet more certain, my eyes reflecting a new awareness that no one else could fully understand. And it was this quiet, undeniable change that drew the attention I had feared. One evening, my father confronted me in a way that made my heart pound violently in my chest, his voice low, sharp, and full of suspicion, questioning why I lingered in the corners of the room, why I seemed distant even when others spoke to me, why I had begun to carry a calm defiance that had not been there before. I could not tell him the truth. The words to describe the love, the presence, the God I had discovered did not exist in the world he knew. And yet I could not lie in a way that denied what had changed me. I whispered small half-truths, careful not to reveal the secret that had become the center of my life, and I felt my chest tighten with both fear and resolve. The elders began to ask questions, subtle at first, then sharper, probing the ways I had grown apart from the traditions I had been taught to follow, and I could feel the danger closing in like a storm, pressing against the fragile flame that had taken root inside me. Even my sister, though younger and less aware, became a point of tension, and I realized that my transformation could not remain hidden for long, that soon the weight of discovery would fall fully upon me, and I would be forced to stand or crumble under the scrutiny of those who held our lives in their hands. And yet, in the quiet moments when I was alone, when I could whisper prayers, when I could read the hidden words of the Bible, I felt a courage I had never known before, a courage that whispered that fear could not control me, that obedience to love was stronger than obedience to terror, that my small heart, trembling as it was, could carry the truth even if the world demanded silence. I began to prepare myself silently for the moment when confrontation would come, knowing that it would, that the flame inside me could not remain hidden forever, and I prayed for guidance, for protection, for the strength to speak and act with integrity, even if it meant loss, even if it meant rejection, even if it meant everything I had ever known would be taken from me. Each night, I pressed the Bible to my chest and whispered the name of the God who had found me, feeling the warmth settle into my bones, and I realized that the moment of danger was not to be feared in the same way it had once been, because I was no longer alone, because a presence had claimed me, because a love had reached me even in the darkest night, and that love would guide me through whatever came next, and that even if I faced wrath, rejection, and isolation, I would not abandon it, would not abandon him, and would not abandon the spark that had become my courage and my life. It started with a look my father gave me one morning as I carried water across the courtyard, a glance sharp and unreadable, full of suspicion and simmering anger, and I felt my chest tighten with a fear I had not experienced since my sister had been taken. The elders began whispering behind closed doors, their voices low but edged with judgment, and I knew that the change in me, the calm strength I had begun to carry, had been noticed. I tried to move carefully, to hide the secret of my heart, to appear obedient, but every step felt like walking on glass, every glance over my shoulder a potential discovery. One evening, my father summoned me to the main room, his eyes blazing, his hands shaking slightly as he gestured for me to sit, and I felt a wave of terror so strong that my small body shivered uncontrollably. "Sawdah," he said, his voice low and cutting. "What are you thinking? You have changed. You have grown distant. Your sister and I see it. The elders see it. Speak, now." My mind raced, the words I had longed to speak dying in my throat because I could not tell him the truth. Not fully, not yet. I could not say the words that would condemn me in his eyes, that would shame our family in the village, and yet I could not lie in the way he expected. I whispered vague assurances, carefully crafted to reveal nothing, and he scowled, his hand slapping the table once, a sound that made my heart leap violently in my chest. Threats began to follow, subtle at first, about family honor, about the shame that disobedience brings, about curses and misfortune, and I realized that even small acts of courage could be dangerous. My sister watched quietly from the corner, her eyes wide with fear and confusion, and I could see the internal struggle within her, the tug between fear and curiosity, and it made my chest ache because I wanted to protect her, yet I could not hide the transformation that was growing inside me. And I remembered the nights of secret prayer, the hours I had spent reading the Bible hidden under my mat, the whispered conversations with a God who had seen me even when the world remained silent, and I felt a quiet courage rise inside me, fragile but undeniable, a courage that demanded I hold my truth even when the world pressed down with threats. My father's voice grew louder, sharper, full of accusation now, and I could hear the whispers of the elders gathering outside the room, murmurs of judgment, words meant to shame and control, and I felt the weight of every eye in the village pressing on my small shoulders. And yet, amidst the fear, I could feel a presence inside me, steady and unwavering, reminding me of the night I had first seen him, the warmth that had flooded my soul, the calm that had replaced the hollow terror. And I realized that even in this moment, I was not alone. I began to speak, carefully, with trembling lips but steady conviction, choosing words that would not reveal everything, but that held the truth of the change inside me, the truth that I could not turn back from the love I had discovered, and I saw my father's anger flare higher, his hands clenching, the veins in his neck standing out, and I knew that the confrontation was only beginning. Threats of shame, of punishment, of curses, of being cast out, rolled off his tongue like a storm I could not escape, and I felt my chest tighten, my pulse racing, my mind crying out for a way to survive, to protect my sister, to hold on to the God who had found me, to keep the spark of courage alive even under the weight of his rage. Every insult, every accusation, in every glance from the elders who had gathered pressed on me like fire, and yet I felt a trembling resolve inside me, a fragile flame that whispered that I could not deny the presence that had claimed my heart, the God who had seen me, the love that had rescued me from fear, and I realized that I had to stand, however small and terrified, because even in the face of wrath, even under the threat of losing everything, the truth I carried inside me could not be silenced, and so I listened to his words, absorbed the weight of his anger, and held onto the quiet, steady presence within, knowing that I was on the edge of something that would demand everything from me, that the storm would not end tonight, that the confrontation would continue, and that I would have to choose in the coming moments on whether to deny him or to let go of everything I had ever known and follow the love that had found me even in darkness. Days turned into nights filled with whispers and suspicion. Every step I took seemed measured, watched. Every word I spoke weighed against an invisible scale that could topple my life. My father's anger did not diminish. It simmered beneath every interaction, sharp glances, clipped commands, and the silence of disapproval that stretched over every corner of our home. The elders came one by one, their words coated in authority and tradition, telling me what a daughter should be, how I had failed to honor my family, how my silence, my defiance, my calm defiance, invited curses not only on me but on my sister, on our home, on everything we held dear. Their voices were relentless, on a drumbeat of accusation that pressed against my chest like stones, and I felt tears gather, threatening to spill over with every word, every threat. They invoked honor, shame, obedience, citing verses and traditions I had memorized since childhood, using them like chains to bind my spirit, and I felt my small body trembling under their weight. And yet, even as I heard their words, I felt the presence inside me, steady, unwavering, reminding me of the light I had seen, the love I had felt, the God who had found me in the darkness. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run, to tell someone, anyone, that I had not done wrong, that I had not sinned, that the courage that grew inside me was not defiance for its own sake, but a response to a love I could not deny. My sister watched quietly, her eyes wide, glimmering with fear and confusion. And I could see the way she was being used, a pawn in the struggle between me and the weight of family honor, and my heart ached. I wanted to reach out to her, to shield her, to share what I had discovered, but the danger was too great, the elders too watchful, my father's anger too volatile. And so I prayed silently, each prayer a trembling thread reaching to the presence that had claimed my heart, asking for courage, protection, guidance, for my sister and for me, for the strength to stand even when the storm pressed so close that I thought I might be swallowed whole. Threats intensified. My father spoke of consequences no child should know, of shame that would follow us forever, of exile, of being cast out, and I felt the full weight of isolation press against my ribs. He used my sister as leverage. I'm telling her that my choices would ruin us both, that she must fear me, that she must obey, and I felt my small body quake with helplessness and determination. I realized that this moment demanded something I had never had before, courage beyond my years, a willingness to risk everything for the love and presence that had rescued me from fear. I could not deny it. I could not turn back. Every whispered word from the elders, every scolding glance from my father, every calculated threat was met with a quiet, trembling resolve that grew inside me. I clutched the hidden Bible to my chest, feeling its warmth, and whispered prayers into the air that carried them far beyond the walls of the room, asking for guidance, for strength, for the courage to speak truth without hatred, without fear controlling me. My heart beat rapidly. A mixture of terror and exhilaration, as I realized that the choice was no longer theoretical, that soon I would have to stand fully in front of my father and the elders and claim the truth I had been shown. And in the quiet, steady presence inside me, I felt a calm certainty that even if the world turned against me, even if I lost everything, I would not be alone, and I would not abandon the light that had found me, the love that had rescued me, the God who had called my name in the night, and I knew that the confrontation ahead would be the defining moment, the crucible in which my courage and faith would be tested, and that I had no choice but to stand, trembling, yet unbroken, and let the truth I carried shine even in the darkness of wrath and shame. The confrontation escalated until every corner of the house seemed charged with tension, every whispered word from the elders pressing on my chest, every glance from my father like a blade. They surrounded me with accusations, invoking shame, dishonor, and fear, using every story, every tradition, every verse I had been taught since childhood as weapons meant to bend me, to break me, to force me to deny the light that had found me in the darkness. My sister watched, trembling and silent, caught between loyalty to our family and the unspoken changes she sensed in me, her small hand brushing mine as if seeking comfort, and I felt the ache of both love and helplessness flood my chest. My father's voice grew louder, more menacing, and he told me that obedience was everything, that defiance would bring ruin upon us all, and that the village would never forgive, that curses would follow, that I would be lost if I continued down the path I had chosen, and the weight of every threat, every accusation, every expectation pressed down on me so heavily that I felt I might crumble beneath it. Yet even as the fear wrapped itself around my chest, I could feel the presence inside me, steady, unwavering, whispering courage into the hollow spaces of my heart, reminding me of the night he had called my name, the warmth, the peace, the love that had never abandoned me. I clutched the hidden Bible against my chest, my small fingers trembling, my lips moving in silent prayer, asking for strength, asking for guidance, asking for the courage to stand, asking for the words to speak that could not be twisted or silenced. And then, in the midst of their accusations, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet, trembling determination that grew with each heartbeat, a courage that demanded I speak, even if my voice shook, even if my father's wrath came crashing down, even if my sister's fear made me ache. I began to whisper truths, not with hatred, not with rebellion, but with the quiet insistence of someone who had been touched by a love greater than fear, a love that had found me when the world was silent, a presence that had claimed my heart and would not let it go. My father's face contorted with fury, the elders muttered curses and threats, my sister clutched my hand tightly, but I did not waver. Each word I spoke, trembling as it was, carried the weight of the unseen presence inside me, the God who had whispered hope into my soul when I had nothing, who had called me by name when I was lost, and who had promised that I was never alone. I could feel the fear pressing in from every side, threatening to overwhelm, but I breathed deeply, whispered a prayer, and let the truth that had been growing inside me flow through my words. The elders faltered. The anger in my father's eyes wavered, and I realized that the power they held was not absolute, that their authority, their threats, their judgment could not touch the courage and presence within me that had been planted and nurtured by something far greater. I stood trembling, yes, small and terrified, yet unbroken, feeling the flame inside me burn brighter with every accusation, every demand to submit, every attempt to silence the truth I now carried openly in my heart. And as the night stretched on, I felt a sense of calm determination settle over me, and a knowing that whatever came next, whether loss, separation, isolation, or scorn, I would not deny him. I would not abandon the love that had saved me. I would not forsake the presence that had claimed my soul. The confrontation had reached a fevered peak, and I knew that the choices I made in the coming hours would shape everything that followed, that the storm was not over, that the road ahead would demand everything I had. Yet for the first time, fear did not have the same hold over me, because I had been touched, called, and claimed by a God who would never leave me. And in that truth, small and trembling though it was, I found a courage that would carry me into the moments to come, toward a path that would demand all of me, and yet give me everything I had longed for in the hidden corners of my life. And in the dark nights of prayer and fear, and I realized with awe and trembling that the love that had found me would lead me through whatever awaited, and that I would not deny him. The morning air was heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath, and I felt the same weight inside my chest, the anticipation, the fear, the trembling of every small bone in my body, because today I would have to stand, fully, and there would be no hiding, no whispering, no secret prayers that could shield me from what was coming. My father's eyes were like fire, and the elders had gathered in the main room, their faces unreadable but their presence a suffocating wall of judgment, expectation, and authority. My sister stood at my side, silent, her small hand brushing mine, and I could feel her fear, her questioning, her trembling courage. And it made my heart ache, made me want to shield her, to protect her from the storm I knew was coming, yet I could not falter. I took a deep breath and prayed silently, asking for strength, for courage, for words that could carry truth without inviting hatred, for the presence that had called me in the dark nights to be tangible here now, in the light of accusation and wrath. My father spoke first, his voice low and dangerous, each word a whip meant to bend me, to make me kneel before fear, to silence the spark of life and courage that had grown inside me. "Sawdah," he said, "you have brought shame to our family, to your sister, to everything we hold sacred. Will you deny these ways, obey and restore honor, or will you continue in this madness that will ruin us all?" I felt every eye on me, the elders' murmurs pressing on my chest, on the weight of the village's judgment waiting in every shadow, but I took a trembling step forward, held my chin higher than I had ever dared, and spoke, my voice shaking yet steady in its truth. "I cannot deny him," I said, and the words themselves felt like fire and water at the same time, cleansing and burning. I have been shown love that I have never known, mercy that I have never felt, a God who sees me, who hears me, who has never abandoned me, and I cannot turn back from him, even if it costs me everything." The room went silent, the tension so thick I could feel it pressing against my skin. My father's face twisted in rage, disbelief, fury, yet there was also a flicker of something else. Perhaps surprise, perhaps the faintest recognition that I was no longer the small, obedient girl he had thought he could shape. The elders shifted uncomfortably, muttering low words to one another, their authority challenged not by rebellion, but by the quiet, trembling conviction that radiated from my small body. My sister's hand squeezed mine, her fear palpable, and I whispered to her silently, "Courage, you are not alone." And I felt her small fingers tighten around mine in response, as if she were drawing strength from the same presence that had carried me through nights of terror. My father's voice rose, sharp and cutting, threatening curses, exile, dishonor, shame. Yet I did not waver. I felt the presence inside me, steady and unwavering, reminding me of the night I had first heard him call my name, reminding me of the warmth, the love, the promise that even in loss and suffering, I would not be abandoned. And so I stood trembling, yes, small and terrified, but yet unbroken, speaking truth without hatred, speaking love without fear, speaking courage without pretending I was unafraid. The elders tried to press further, to bend me, to force compliance, but I could see their words falling flat against the shield of the presence inside me, the light that had claimed my heart and refused to be silenced. My father's hand trembled as he gestured, anger and frustration etched into every line of his face. Yet even in the storm of wrath around me, I could feel a strange calm, a quiet certainty, a knowing that whatever came next, I had already been changed forever by the God who had found me, by the love that had whispered courage into my soul, by the presence that had never abandoned me in the darkest nights. I took another trembling breath and said again, more firmly this time, "I will not deny him, and I will not turn back. I will follow the God who has rescued me, even if it costs everything." The silence stretched, thick and heavy, and then, slowly, I felt the first stirrings of something I had not expected. Respect, acknowledgement, the faintest crack in the armor of fear that had surrounded me for so long, and I realized that even in the face of wrath, even under the threat of loss, the presence inside me was greater, stronger, unshakable, and I was no longer the small girl who had trembled in secret. I was someone touched by love, claimed by grace, standing at the edge of a new life, trembling but unbroken, terrified but courageous, and I knew that whatever storms followed, whatever losses came, I would not deny him. I would not abandon the presence that had saved me, and I would not let fear dictate the life I had been given anew. The room seemed to hold its breath as I stood trembling, yet unbroken, my heart pounding fiercely in my chest, aware that every word I spoke now would define everything that followed. My father's hands clenched, his jaw tight, the elders' murmurs growing louder, but I could feel the presence inside me steadying my voice, guiding my breath, giving me courage beyond what my small body could produce alone. "I am not turning back," I said, my voice rising slightly, shaking yet firm, "because I have found a love that the world cannot give, a God who has seen me, held me, and called me by name when no one else would. I will follow him, even if I lose everything." For a moment, the silence that followed was so heavy that I thought the world itself had stopped, as if waiting to see whether I would falter or stand. My father's eyes burned with a mixture of fury, disbelief, and a strange, incomprehensible tension, and I realized that my words had cut deeper than any slap, any shouting could have. The elders shifted, unease creeping into their faces, and I felt a small, tremulous satisfaction, not from victory over them, but from knowing that the truth I carried could not be silenced, that my heart had claimed a courage that could not be extinguished by threats or intimidation. My sister's hand squeezed mine, her small fingers trembling, and I whispered to her, "Do not be afraid. This is our path now. He is with us." And in that moment, I felt the full weight of the presence I had encountered that night, the God who had rescued me, who had whispered love into the hollow corners of my soul, who had carried me through fear, and who now filled me with a peace and strength that no earthly wrath could touch. My father's voice finally broke the silence, sharp and cutting, yet laced with exhaustion, anger, and the faintest glimmer of something I could not name. "You have chosen," he said, and I could see in his eyes a mixture of resignation and fury, the acknowledgement that I was no longer the child he had controlled, no longer the obedient girl he had shaped. The elders murmured among themselves, and I realized that the confrontation had reached its peak, that the storm had not destroyed me, and that the presence I carried within had held firm against every threat, every accusation, every attempt to bend me. And yet, I knew that the cost of standing would be steep, a home that would no longer feel safe, a family torn, on the judgment of a community that had been everything I had ever known. But I also knew, deep in my soul, that the love and courage I had been given were worth any loss, worth any consequence. I stepped back slightly, taking a deep breath, feeling the tremor in my body, the racing of my heart, and yet also feeling the steady, unwavering presence that had guided me from darkness into light. I realized then that this was the true meaning of courage, of faith, of surrender, not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand in truth despite it, to follow the path of love even when it demands everything we have, and to trust that the presence that had rescued us in the night would not abandon us now. The elders finally left, muttering and murmuring, the weight of tradition and authority receding slightly. And though the echoes of their disapproval would linger, and my father turned away, the anger still burning, but the confrontation over, for now, I sank to the floor, trembling, exhausted, my chest heaving, and felt a wave of relief and awe wash over me, the kind that comes when one has faced the storm and survived, when one has stood for truth and found strength, when one has given everything and yet received something far greater in return. My sister leaned against me, silent, her eyes wide but calmer, and I whispered again, "He is with us. We are not alone." And in that quiet moment, I felt the full weight of the transformation inside me, the courage that had grown in secret, the love that had rescued me, and I knew that no threat, no anger, no worldly consequence could take that away. And because I had been touched by a God whose love could not be broken, whose presence could not be silenced, whose power to save was greater than fear, greater than wrath, greater than loss, and I realized with trembling awe that the journey ahead would be challenging, dangerous, uncertain, yet filled with a peace and freedom I had never known. And for the first time since my childhood ended, I felt whole, seen, and ready to step into the life I had been given anew, guided by the God who had called my name, loved me, and would never let me go. After the storm of confrontation passed, a strange quiet settled over the house, a quiet that was heavy with tension, but also charged with the sense of something new taking root. I felt every heartbeat in my chest, the tremor of exhaustion mixed with relief. I knowing that I had stood for truth and had not wavered, and yet realizing that the journey was far from over. My father's silence was sharp and cutting, the elder's departure leaving an echo of judgment in the empty rooms, and my sister clung to me, her small body trembling, seeking comfort in the one place she had always felt safe. But amidst the fear, the uncertainty, and the lingering weight of what had been, I could feel the warmth, the presence, the love that had carried me through the darkest nights. It was steady and unshakable, a light in the midst of shadows, a reassurance that even when all else seemed lost, I was not alone. In the days that followed, I began to experience something I had never known, a deep, abiding peace that no threat or anger could touch, and a sense of worth and dignity that had been buried beneath years of fear and obedience. I could feel the healing begin, slowly, imperceptibly at first, in the small moments of prayer, in the secret readings of Scripture, in the quiet trust that had replaced trembling fear. I realized that the God who had called my name, who had found me in the nights of despair, was not only a rescuer, but a healer, a presence that could restore the parts of me that had been broken, silenced, and used. My sister began to watch me differently, curiosity mingling with fear still, but also with a glimmer of hope, and I realized that my courage and my transformation could be a light for her, a bridge to something she could not yet fully understand, but might one day embrace. I spent hours in prayer, tears streaming, on whispering gratitude for the presence that had carried me, asking for continued guidance, for protection, for the ability to forgive those who had sought to control and harm me. And in that surrender, I began to feel a freedom unlike anything I had known. The memories of abuse, of fear, of manipulation were still there, heavy and raw, but they no longer defined me, no longer held power over the trajectory of my life, because I had been touched by a love stronger than any harm I had endured. I began to reach out to a new spiritual family, finding other believers who had walked similar paths, sharing our stories, praying together, and feeling the bonds of connection, trust, and love that I had never felt in my home or community. Each day I grew stronger. Each day the flame inside me burned brighter. And when I realized that the life I had been given was no longer dictated by fear, shame, or obedience to human authority, but by a love that demanded courage, truth, and surrender. I forgave, not because the pain was gone, but because holding it would only bind me to the past. I forgave because the love that had rescued me was greater than anger, greater than loss, greater than fear, and as I stepped into the world with this new courage, with this new life, I felt the presence of the God who had called me in the night, guiding my steps, whispering hope into my heart, and reminding me that I was never alone, that I was loved, and that the freedom I had found was not a fleeting gift, but a permanent inheritance for those willing to trust, to surrender, and to follow even when the world demanded silence. And I thought of the millions of others trapped in fear, in shame, in silence, and I realized that my story, my testimony, could be a beacon, a light that whispered hope, a gentle invitation that even in the darkest nights, the God who rescues the broken still calls, still loves, still restores. And in that realization, I felt a deep, abiding joy, a peace that no threat could touch, a freedom that no chain could bind, and I knew that my life, once stolen, once silenced, had been given back to me in fullness through the love, mercy, and presence of Jesus Christ, the one who had found me, healed me, and would never let me go. In the quiet moments that followed, I began to truly understand what freedom meant. It was not just the absence of fear, the lifting of threats, or the fading of anger. It was the presence of love. At the presence of a God who had seen me when no one else did, who had held me in the dark nights, who had whispered hope when despair threatened to drown me. My sister and I sat together in our small room, the evening sun casting warm light across our faces, and I could see the cautious relief in her eyes, the first glimmers of trust that I was no longer alone, that we had each other, and that the God who had rescued me could protect us both. I thought of the years we had lost, of the innocence stolen, of the nights of fear, yet even in that sorrow, I felt a deep, tender gratitude, because the presence that had carried me had not abandoned me, had not allowed bitterness to consume me, had turned pain into courage, silence into truth, and fear into surrender. I began to read more from the Bible. I not just secretly under blankets, but openly when the house was quiet, and each verse, each promise, each story of love and redemption filled me with courage, with hope, with the certainty that I had been chosen for something far greater than the abuse and fear that had defined my early years. I felt compelled to share my story, to let others know that even in the darkest corners of shame and tradition, God's love can find you, can rescue you, can heal you, and that you do not have to remain bound by fear, by expectation, by the sins and mistakes of others, because the one who calls you by name is greater than all of that. I reached out to others online, to communities of believers who had faced persecution, who had left behind oppressive traditions, and I found connection, prayer, support, and love. Yet realizing that family is not always defined by blood, but by the people and presence who walk with you, who lift you when fear presses close, who remind you that love is stronger than chains, stronger than shame, stronger than loss. I baptized my heart fully into the love of Jesus, surrendering everything, my fears, my doubts, my sorrow, my longing, and in that surrender, I felt something I had never known, true peace, true joy, and a freedom that even the worst threats of men could not touch. I prayed for my father, for the elders, for those who had sought to bind me, asking God to show them the love that I had found, knowing that forgiveness was not just a gift to them, but a liberation for me, because holding on to anger and pain would only weigh me down and dim the light that had claimed my soul. And as I walked in the days that followed, and I felt my steps lighter, my heart fuller, my spirit freer, I could face the world, face threats, face scorn and judgment, because the God who had rescued me was walking with me, and that presence was greater than anything the world could throw at me. I thought of the millions of girls and women trapped in fear, in silence, in abuse, and I whispered prayers for them, longing that they too might hear his call, feel his love, and find the courage to step into freedom. I realized that my story was no longer just mine. It was a testimony of hope, a beacon for those who had been silenced, a reminder that even the smallest, most vulnerable among us can be claimed by a God whose power to rescue and heal is boundless. And though the memories of abuse and fear would never completely vanish, they no longer held me. They were shadows behind me. Eclipsed by the brilliance of love that had saved me, redeemed me, and restored my life, I now walk in light, in courage, in peace, with the God who called me by name guiding every step, whispering strength into every moment, reminding me that even in the aftermath of betrayal and pain, love remains, hope remains, and life can be reclaimed and renewed. My sister and I hold each other's hands, our hearts connected not only by blood, but by the shared journey of survival, faith, and love. And I know that whatever storms lie ahead, whatever struggles still await, we are not alone, because he who rescued me still walks beside us, still strengthens us, still loves us beyond measure. And as I close my eyes at night, I whisper a prayer for every broken heart, every silenced voice, every child trapped in fear, unknowing that the same God who rescued me can rescue them too, that his love is boundless, his mercy unending, and his presence unshakable. And in that knowledge, I rest, I breathe, I hope, and I live, because Jesus has given me back my life, my courage, my voice, and my heart, and he will never let me go.